Hello lovelies and welcome to Amy of Melbourne, where today we're kitting out my Singer Treadle Sewing Machine with some very useful accessories made from scraps and leftovers. Today we're embarking on a delightful journey to create a charming hussif, a small humble sewing kit that holds within it all the treasures of sewing. It is the very essence of make, do and mend. First, let's gather our materials. For this project, we'll need an assortment of fabric scraps, wadding, some thread, a needle, and a few basic sewing tools. I'm using scraps from a previous project, one of my Scardy quilted vests. I save most of my scraps or cabbage and try to use them as often as possible when making little accessories like this. I'm going to try to use my treadle sewing machine. This is new to me, but is actually nearly 100 years old. It's important when you're treadling that you feel the rhythm of the machine itself and allow it to do the work for you. I started this project with a simple pin cushion in mind. I was sick and tired of the collection of pins I seemed to leave next to my machine. As I began to sew this little pouch, I thought, what a wonderful opportunity this would be to practice using my treadle machine. So I kept going back to my cabbage patch to find pieces to add. Today's ideas are for a scissor pouch, a second pin cushion with divided sections for needles, and finally a hussif came to mind. Honestly, I was not careful when I made these items. I didn't measure before I cut my fabric, I didn't pre-mark my stitch lines to keep them straight, and I pressed minimally. I tried not to worry if it was perfect, and instead focus on the joy in experimenting with colours and techniques. This is just for me, and its level of execution is of no consequence whatsoever. The hussif will need pockets to hold needles, scissors and threads, and each of these needs to be cut and assembled with my merry mix of scraps. Once my pieces are cut, it's time to assemble them. I began by using my treadle as intended, but the age of the drive band became problematic quickly as it disintegrated with the tension of the spinning treadle. I turned to hand stitching, piecing the patchwork of the main outer fabric instead. I will admit that I need far more practice with hand sewing for construction. I'm used to paper piecing and whip stitching binding on by hand, but creating a straight seam using hand stitches was surprisingly challenging. The hussif, also known as a housewife, or housewife, or even a hussy, is a traditional portable sewing kit with a rich history tied to practicality, craftsmanship, and the hidden history of women and domestic life. The hussif originates from the term housewife, and it was designed to hold small tools like needles, thread, and scissors, essential for home sewing and quick repairs. People from all levels of society owned such an item, but the materials it was made from were the obvious variable between social and economic classes. Hussifs typically include various pockets, needles, thread, bodkins, wax, scissors, pins, buttons, darning tools and wool thread, and importantly, thimbles. The earliest reference I could find to a hussy was in the 1740s, the first novel, which was titled Pamela. The novel mentions the hussy several times in passing in a colloquial context, which suggests its commonplace nature already at this time. In the Victorian era, it became formalised due to the prevalence of household magazines and books, essential for women before mass-produced clothing. It also became more popular in the growing middle class of women who would spend much of their time attending social morning calls, Needlework was an acceptable pastime to bring on visits to friends, family, and even when going to church. The hussy gained popularity among soldiers in the Civil War and both World Wars for uniform repairs, and was often made by mothers, wives, and sweethearts with personalised fancy work for their menfolk to take to war. They are so useful that for many armies they became standard issue in the Second World War. In Australia, a team of 15 women at H.E. Barry and Son in Brunswick, Melbourne, made all of our army's housewives, as well as their shirts, shorts, and trousers. The prevalence of the hussif declined in the early 20th century as mass-produced clothing began to expand and people replaced clothing rather than mending it. I am creating a tiny pocket for my leather thimble and a small disc of beeswax that I got from the Lost Trades Fair in Bendigo last year. I'm also going to add a gathered pouch to the bottom of the roll. To create this pocket, I cheated and used my modern sewing machine. It's not really cheating. This is something that I'm making only for myself, and hand stitching the eyelets did not bring me joy today, so I decided that I would use my sewing machine and my eyelet stitch rather than spending all the extra time doing that by hand, so that I can save my stitches for the pretty fancy work on the outside. When I have made rolled sewing kits previously, I've added zips, but for this one I wanted to make something more historically minded to match my treadle. So instead, this one has a tie to cinch the pouch. This isn't a travel kit. It's one to live in the tiny drawers of my Singer, so it doesn't need to be super secure. Just enough to stay organised while I sew. Many of the housewives I have seen contained a round pin cushion with divided sections for sorting and storing needles. I made one and added a button with a tiny magnet in the centre. To fill my pin cushions, I have a lovely mix of walnut shell and lavender. It smells really nice, but practically the walnut shells help to sharpen my needles and pins. I'm going to give this a chance, but at this moment, it feels hefty as a permanent feature of my kit, so I may add a needle book made of wool felt instead in the future. While I was working, I was watching YouTube, and as I let the algorithm decide what I was to consume, two important videos came forward. One by Shannon Makes and the other by Christine Vike, both on the art of Victorian crazy patchwork. I looked down at my own patchwork and was 100% influenced. I fetched some embroidery floss in matching purples, greens and creams and began hand sewing decorative stitches along the edges of all of my patchwork piecing. I adore fancy work, and I find hand sewing allows for a slower, more meditative experience. Each stitch can be a moment of mindfulness, connecting you further to your creation. A hussif is not just a practical tool, but also a reflection of your creativity and care. It's a piece of art ready to accompany you on your sewing adventures. As I was working on all of the hand embroidery sections, I noticed that one of my seams had started to come apart. Again, my hand stitching needs some work, but to repair this, rather than take apart all of this work, I decided to grab a small piece of lace that I was saving for a future project, but will be just as good here, to cover over that raw edge so that it can no longer fray apart. To finish creating my patchworked hussif, I sandwiched together the patchwork layer with the wadding, and then finally the internal lining. I'd already stitched my little pockets to the internal lining, and all I needed to do was baste these layers together and then finish them with a binding that I stitched by hand. closure on this housewife is simply a piece of ribbon. I've added it inside the binding and I just wrap it around and tie it with a bow. Perfect. Perfect and perfectly simple. I followed basically the same procedure for creating the pouch for my scissors. I will say that at one point I went upstairs and I made sure that I had actually cut this in a straight diamond shape, but somewhere along the lines I recut and it is no longer straight. So there we have it, all of my lovely accessories handmade from scraps, ready to assist me in my sewing journeys on my treadle sewing machine. Thank you so much for joining me. May your hussif serve you well, filled with the whimsy and joy of all of your future sewing projects. I'm going to go and make something else, and I'll see you later.